I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we look at updates from across the battlefront, analyse the alleged Russian plan to sabotage European energy, and we discuss the militarisation of Russian society and ask what it means for the country's future.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
We need a military strategy for Ukraine to gain a decisive advantage on the battlefield, to win the war.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Wednesday, the 19th of April, 1 year and 54 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by our Associate Editor Dominic Nicholls, Assistant Comment Editor Francis Durnley, Brussels correspondent Joe Barnes, and former tank commander and Telegraph commentator Hamish de Bretton-Gordon. I started by asking Dom for the latest news from Ukraine.
Well, hi David, hi everybody. We start with a slightly odd report coming out of the Russian-installed council down in Zaporizhia region. So a guy called Vladimir Rogov, don't think we've heard of him before. He's a member of the council, the Russian-installed council in Zaporizhia. He has said a group of Ukrainian armed forces tried to probe the defence around the town of Orikhiv, which is about 40 k's southeast of Zaporizhia last night. He says, Rogov said it was unusual for Ukrainian forces to test Russian defences during the night, but said it was due to what he says was new nighttime equipment. Now, I say this is odd because if there'd been some major breakthrough, we'd have heard about it. And if there'd been some major defeat, we would have heard about it in glowing terms from Russia. So I'm not sure what the purpose of this is. I mean, there's likely to be probing up and down the line from both sides, looking for the gaps, testing the defences, seeing what the dispositions and strengths of the enemy are. So I don't think the attack, such as it seems to be, is anything to be surprised about. And as for this new nighttime equipment, well, I mean, it might be night vision goggles for the individual soldiers, maybe thermal imaging for the individual or for any vehicles they've got. They could be thermal or night vision devices for vehicles and other weapons. But, I just make the point that if it had been significant in either way, a massive defeat or a huge breakthrough, we would have heard about it through other channels and to greater depth. So, yeah, mark and move on. We expect this up and down the line. This region, Zaporizhia, it's down to the southwest of Bakhmut and Avdiivka, where the main fighting has been of late. I mean, that is on the route. If you wanted to push through there, you would head towards Melitopol and the coast. So, as we've said, and not just us, but many other commentators have said for weeks now, that would be a very sensible way for Ukraine to try and attack, to get through to the coast that way, splitting Russian defences into two, one in Crimea and just the area immediately to the north, and then one in the Donbass. But of course, Russia knows this. I mean, they are building defences in the region. So, I don't think we can what if for endlessly on the very little information we have. So I think we just mark and move on that. Secondly, Ukraine last night said it had come under attack in the Odessa region, said it had shot down 10 Russian kamikaze drones. So this comes from General Mykola Olenchuk, who's the commander of the Ukrainian Air Force. He said 10 or 12 Iranian-made Shahed 136 drones, the ones we've seen throughout this the full-scale invasion, had been destroyed by the Odessa air defences overnight in the attack on the southern city, the port city there on the south coast. I mean, there's no reports of casualties yet, but if you look at the imagery that we're carrying on our website and will be elsewhere, I mean, there's a lot of destruction, and I'd be surprised if there are no casualties that come from that. I mean, we had thought that Russia was trying to hang on to its missile stocks, its drone stocks. In fact, Joe was there as well. We were in a briefing yesterday with a Western official who was suggesting that Russia actually is withholding its stocks of these types of munitions in anticipation of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. And actually, the Western official said that has given Ukraine some breathing space. They've not had to expend their air defence munitions because there's nothing coming at them from the other way. So there's a bit of kind of air defense cat and mouse going on at the moment. The proposed or the anticipated counteroffensive is really, and this is of course exactly what Ukraine want to do, it's really playing with planners' minds, because you've got to war game it, you've got to second guess it, you've got to come up with a com plan, a contingency plan, then you've got to have a com plan for that one, and you've got to war game it to the nth degree. So you can easily spin yourself up in circles here, which is why planning staffs need to make sensible, logical deductions, and then someone make a decision on that and go for it. I was always told in the military that make a decision or make the right decision or make the wrong decision, but just make a decision. The cost, the penalty of inaction and dithering and being indecisive is often much worse than making a wrong decision. Action galvanizes people, even if it turns out that you're doing the wrong thing. Just the energy and the things in motion, you can actually, it's easier to shift the focus of a failed or a failing effort rather than try and start from scratch. Anyway, I digress. The last point I'll make is reports from Alexei Reznikov, Ukraine's defense minister. He says that Ukraine has received its first batteries of Patriot air defense missiles, some of the most advanced air defense systems in the world. So he's tweeted, "Today, our beautiful Ukrainian sky becomes more secure because Patriot air defense systems have arrived in Ukraine. Our air defenders have mastered them as fast as they could, and our partners have kept their word." And he then went on to thank American, German, and Dutch, or the American, German, and Dutch people, not just three people at random, but the American, German, and Dutch people, because we think what we think Ukraine is being gifted is one battery of Patriots each from the US and Germany, and then 2 batteries from the Netherlands. So Patriots, just to quickly go over these again, we talked about them some weeks ago when the announcement was made that they were going to be gifted, and the training, the US was training about 100 people from the Ukrainian armed forces in the US were training them in Germany. So Patriots got about 150k range, but that is obviously best case, so sort of straight line and at a high-flying target. So high-flying targets, the Tupolevs that are flying, the big Russian Tupolev Tu-22Ms that are flying over Russia and firing these long-range cruise missiles over Russian airspace. They're not coming over Ukrainian airspace. They're firing from the Kursk region, the Belgorod region, just to the north and northeast of Ukraine. So it might make those forces think twice if they know there's a Patriot out there somewhere. Unlikely, because the suggestion that as controversial as it may be, but the suggestion that Ukraine would use American gifted weapons to fire into Russia is still seen as quite controversial. So I don't know if those Tupolev bombers would be under immediate threat, but it's enough to put a seed of doubt into the pilots' minds and into the planners' minds. I mean, a lower flying aircraft would be able to get much closer, just simply because of the way that the radar works. But the point to make is that Ukrainian air defense so far has relied very heavily on S-300, the old air defense missiles that it inherited from the Soviet Union. S-300, it's old, so it's less accurate, less advanced from systems like Patriots. Ukraine's also got the IRIS-T from Germany and the NASAMS, again from the US and Norway, I think, from memory. And those three, Patriot, IRIS-T, and NASAMS, can share radar, share target data. So they're much more advanced systems. Okay, so it's much better to have these than the dwindling stocks of S-300s, which we think Ukraine's running out of anyway. And Alexei Reznikov, the final point here, he said in the past, so he didn't say today about the Patriots, but in the past he's made the point. He said, in the future, we plan to integrate this system, that's the Patriots, in the NATO air and missile defense system. This will bring us closer to NATO, to our membership in the alliance. So, never miss an opportunity to get the point in there about Ukrainian aspirations for NATO membership. But it is an important point that even if NATO membership might be some way off, the more Ukrainian military systems are integrated and fundamentally knitted into, down at the code level, NATO systems, then we're starting to talk about security guarantees. So they might not be in NATO, they might not have NATO Article 5 protection, but if they're in the big system and sharing data and getting intelligence sent to them on the, in this case, air defense, but it works for other systems as well, then that's not for naught. Don't overlook that. That has a significant military value in its own right. And I'll take a breath there.
Thank you very much for that, Dom. Joe and Francis, there's quite a few political and diplomatic updates. So, Francis, can I come to you first? What have you been looking at?
Well, thanks, David. I know listeners will be on tenterhooks for an update on the grain deal. Well, I have one, followed by a story of Russian ships being accused of North Sea sabotage and some further updates on the Pentagon leaks. But on the grain deal, Ukraine's agriculture minister has confirmed that the transit of Ukrainian grain and food products will resume through Poland following an agreement reached in talks with Warsaw. Now, that was ongoing yesterday, which I reported on. Now, we understand that this agriculture minister has raised concerns about the status of the agreement with Moscow on the safe passage of ships carrying grain from Ukrainian Black Sea ports. He said it's maybe impossible to predict how many vessels Moscow would allow through, but nonetheless, the agreement that's been reached with Poland is a positive step after all of the shenanigans over the weekend of certain countries essentially blocking the grain entering their respective countries for fear of what it will do to the food markets there. I think Bulgaria may still have a temporary block, but we'll have to monitor that closely. Interestingly, inspections of ships transporting Ukrainian grain have resumed under the UN brokered agreement, despite Russia being accused by Ukraine of delaying inspections, which led to a halt in grain shipments at the same time this was going on. This has been a long-term issue and will continue, I'm sure, because, of course, the leverage that Russia gets from this grain deal is substantial, as I touched on yesterday. And so I think we can expect this to be a continuing saga for as long as it benefits both sides for it to be so. And that is the current state of things in the diplomatic sphere. And so I expect this will be something that we will have to continue to return to. But nonetheless, some positive steps from where we were yesterday on that story. Now, staying with ships, a fascinating read on the BBC website today about Russian ships accused of North Sea sabotage. Now, Russia, according to them, have, and it's a big investigation, and I'll come to who's involved in it in a moment. But the central headline of this is that Russia has a program to sabotage wind farms and communication cables in the North Sea, according to new allegations. So the details have come from a joint investigation by public broadcasters in Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Finland, where I know we have many listeners. It says that Russia has a fleet of vessels disguised as fishing trawlers and research vessels in the North Sea. They apparently carry underwater surveillance equipment and are mapping key sites for possible sabotage. Now, the BBC understands that UK officials are aware of Russian vessels moving around UK waters as part of this programme. And the first of this series of reports is due to be broadcast on Wednesday by DR in Denmark, NRK in Norway, SVT in Sweden, and AYLE in Finland. Now, a Danish counter-offensive officer who's cited in the BBC piece says that the sabotage plans are being prepared in case of a full conflict with the West, whilst the head of Norwegian intelligence has told the broadcasters that the programme was considered highly important for Russia and controlled directly from Moscow. The broadcasters say that they've analysed intercepted Russian communications which indicate so-called ghost ships sailing in Nordic waters, which have turned off their transmitters so as not to reveal their locations. And more broadly, this report really raises the possibilities of these vessels being linked with numerous incidents, which we've actually reported on in the past, quite often as fleeting references because we don't know much more at the time, of incidents of apparent sabotage and disruption. There was an incident south of, I think it was Salvald or last year, when an underwater data cable was cut. There was the Shetland Islands in October last year when a cable was cut. And in both of those incidents, there was believed to be foreign meddling involved. And it would appear that these investigations point the finger at these Russian vessels. In the case of the Shetlands one, it was quite significant because it cut off communication activity on the islands and was considered a direct violation of all sorts of international rules if it was of foreign agents involved. So a very interesting story, this, and I imagine there'll be some further revelations to come as the programmes are broadcast. But I know that our other guests today will also have some thoughts on this, David.
Thanks, Francis. Yes, Joe, do you want to come in and add anything to that?
Yeah, so on these ghost ships, it's not a new issue that's been raised by this broadcast investigation. What they have done, though, is they've managed to get, and I've done the piece for online, and it will hopefully go in the paper as the day develops, but they've got this fantastic picture of a man in a balaclava with a military grade rifle, which is on board this. It's called the Admiral Vladimirsky, which is officially an oceanic research vessel, but it was identified by the broadcast investigation as one of the main protagonist ships, one of these 50 ships that are Russian, likely with their transponders or transmitters turned off, operating in the North Sea. The Dutch equivalent of MI5 and MI6, called AIVD, they earlier this year warned that Russian ships were caught mapping installations in the North Sea. And so these are installations that are very close to British shores, but also our allies in the Netherlands, Belgium, Scandinavian countries, Denmark, Sweden, then up to Finland. So it's a really crunch bit. And then I'll just add a little bit to the grain debate, because the European Commission has intervened earlier today, and Ursula von der Leyen has written to the 5 Eastern European governments, basically annoyed at the prospect of cheap Ukrainian grain affecting their farmers, and promised a €100 million aid package for their farmers. We don't know how that's going to work, but what we do know is going to be there to support the farmers in the likes of Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria. And that comes on top of I think it was €46 million offered to them earlier this year. But I sat for a European Commission press briefing today on it, and they didn't quite have the details nailed down. I think we're going to learn more today and tomorrow about because they talked about these plans, like, could there be countermeasures? Could it mean that tariffs eventually come on grain? Because currently Ukraine has quota-free and tariff-free access to the EU's market. Does that mean grain could be hit by a small quota if it stays in Poland or the like? But we don't know yet. That's kind of speculation. And I will stop there because I believe Francis has a few more diplomatic updates.
Thanks, Joe. Yes, there's just one other story I thought we should draw attention to, which is an interesting read in the FT about the latest on the Pentagon leaks. Now, the piece is called How a Low-Ranked 21-Year-Old Accessed Top US Secrets, and essentially it looks through the background of this individual, Jack Teixeira, head who has, of course, been subject to some scrutiny in recent days. Now, he held one of the military's lowest enlist ranks and was essentially an IT worker in the Massachusetts Air National Guard. But even so, he received top secret clearance to maintain and secure the Air Force's various computer networks, including some of its most sensitive ones. And what the FT have done is they've looked at how these units operate and how he would have access to this kind of material. His unit, the 102nd Intelligence Wing, processes intelligence for US military commands and is one of about half a dozen Air National Guard intelligence users carrying out similar work. Now, he's not believed to have prepared any of this intelligence, but apparently he was able to have access to it and print it without triggering any alarm bells. Even in a role, one former intelligence official that they cite in the article likened to that of a janitor. So he says, we've got a low-level people who have had access to stuff because we're not going to have a 4-star general emptying waste baskets and cleaning desks. That's according to the former official. So essentially underlining this point that these people are sort of tidying up these documents and helping organise them, etc. And that's how they have access to them, much like a, say, janitor would in an office. But of course, it's quite dangerous. And the piece goes on and talks about one challenge for the Pentagon is that its ranks are largely made up of young people. More than 2/3 of active duty service members are 30 or under, who increasingly live online, particularly since the COVID-19 pandemic left many sort of feeling isolated or unable to work. Now, the leaks have prompted the US government to launch several probes to determine how it shares information and who can access it, as well as how the disclosures may have harmed national security. So this is an ongoing story, but I think the isolation point that they raise is particularly interesting. I remember attending a private event where a very senior figure from the British intelligence services argued that the lockdowns would serve as a breeding ground for subversion. The nature of so many people driven online makes people more easily corruptible, radicalized, or simply careless. And in a similar vein, I was visiting a major government department recently, I won't say which one, where I was surprised at how few civil servants worked in the office as opposed to from home. And I couldn't help but wonder about the psychological impact of that. is one as likely to be as loyal to one's colleagues, one's country, if you're doing all of your work over Zoom? It's a rather ephemeral platform. There's a slight hint of unreality about it. If you're doing the same, if you're conducting sensitive work on using the same software that you do to buy your groceries or do to talk to friends, does it undermine the importance of that work and in your own mind, as opposed to if it was printed on a document in front of you with official heading? I don't know, but it's something I've been reflecting on, but I thought it was an interesting point that was raised in the context of this article. But just lastly, on the theme of Pentagon leaks, we touched briefly on this in the past, but I just wanted to draw attention to it again in more detail. According to one of the leaks, the UK is among a number of countries with military special forces operating inside Ukraine. According to the document, which is dated the 23rd of March, the UK has the largest contingent of special forces in Ukraine, around 50, followed by fellow NATO states Latvia 17, France 15, the US 14, and the Netherlands 1. I'd love to know what that chap's doing, but anyway. The document does not say where the forces are located or what they are doing. We've suspected for a while now that NATO troops may be involved in disrupting GRU officers operating in Poland, but nothing concrete before this that they're operating in Ukraine. So it's an interesting story, and one that, of course, Russian commentators have been quick to pick up on. But I just wanted to draw attention to it because it's something that in the context of the leaks, there's so much to cover we've not covered in depth. So I just wanted to make a reference to it, David.
Thank you very much, Francis. Joe Barnes, can we come to you? There's two stories you've written up, which I think are both fascinating. One of them is based on one of the Pentagon leaks. Let's put that to one side for the moment. Can we go back into Europe? You've written up a fascinating story about how France is now under pressure to back future EU sanctions on Russia's nuclear industry, thanks to a diplomatic move by Germany. Can you tell us what's happening here?
Okay, so the EU, to give you some context, has 10 rounds of sanctions that it has levelled on Vladimir Putin, his closest associates, and the Russian economy in order to crack down and starve the Russian war machine of finance and influence. And the EU are working on an 11 package of sanctions, but it's getting increasingly harder for them to find a consensus amongst their 27 member states of what area to hit. So there's been a group called the Sanctionistas. They're made up of Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. The former countries that have lived under the Soviet umbrella are obviously the hardest that you can find when it comes to Russian issues. Then the likes of Hungary, Germany, and other countries have been less forward in pressing things like fossil fuels. The EU currently has a ban and transition to phase out of oil, gas and coal from Russia. But the next area of energy that Russia has influence in Europe is the nuclear sector. Rosatom, its state-owned nuclear firm, essentially, nuclear enterprise, is building a nuclear reactor for Hungary with using a Russian finance loan. But interestingly, Germany, which has closed down its nuclear plants now in the wake of Fukushima, it kept them on a little bit throughout the winter in order to get through any potential energy crisis caused by the war in Ukraine. But Germany has now come out and said it supports sanctions on Russia's nuclear sector. And it's not often that European politicians, unless they are truly, truly, truly peeved off, will come out and name another country, especially if they're an opponent to this kind of sanction. So while Hungary has vocally opposed hitting Russia's nuclear sector for various reasons, as I've elaborated, France has remained a far stealthier opponent to that plan. And so what we know is France is EDF, it's state-owned, state-run nuclear giant, has deals with Rosatom where they enrich fuel, re-enrich fuel, but they also dispose of spent nuclear fuel rods in Russia. So France is actually probably hidden behind Hungary to a certain degree in opposing any countenance of EU nuclear sanctions on Russia. But now Germany, a member of its government, a guy called Sven Giegold, who is a state secretary in the German finance ministry, a former MEP in Brussels and Strasbourg, is a member of the German Green Party, has essentially come out and said, look, like, we will get through this. We will beat the opposition of France, and he names France and other countries, by implementing transition periods and basically working out a diplomatic way of getting to a nuclear sanctions. But it's fascinating for one, because France and Germany, they're not the best of friends at the moment, but they're not known for the public berating of each other, even when times are tough. So Germany's come out and basically put its stall out and blamed France for any blockage in this policy. It's a policy that Vladimir Zelensky, the Ukraine's president, has repeatedly called on EU countries to back. And so in these, we haven't got much in the way of detail, but I've spoken to a number of my sources in Brussels, and what we do have is a sort of sketch of a proposal that has been drawn up by Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and it's got the backing of Kyiv, and I'm sure Germany will sign off on this as well. And what they're talking of doing is they're looking at putting asset freezes and travel bans on Rosatom's highest ranking officials. But what they also want to do is start banning the imports of Russian nuclear materials, whether it be components for reactors or the fuel itself. They haven't actually got that far yet, but that's what they're going to start doing and start proposing as the EU discusses its 11th package of sanctions. I've spoken to numerous people, and to quote one diplomat who's got a lot of skin in the game, we don't want to hurt those who really need it. Some countries have asked us not to kill their energy supplies. So, look, these countries, they are absolutely hardline, but they have learned over the course of negotiating 10 sanctions packages, they can't go full Tonto and demand absolutely everything. They've got to work out the wriggle room. That was used with Germany and Hungary and other people who, when we were looking at the EU was looking at its oil ban from the EU for Russia and its gas bans. There's wriggle rooms, and you can implement transition periods. It's just quite fascinating that Germany, minus its nuclear sector, which is now turned off, has come out and put its flag in the ground. And I guess it just shows that there's a fair deal of tension at the moment between the French government and the German government over how they both deal with China and other various issues that are wider than the EU's kind of scope. But now Germany has kind of put its flag out and said, look, we're annoyed with what you've done in the past, and we're gonna dig a hole for you to get yourself into. And I'll stop there on that one.
Thank you very much, Joe. Just one more story from you, if we may. You've written up another story from the Pentagon leaks. It gives us a fascinating glimpse into diplomacy between the UN Secretary General and Volodymyr Zelensky in Ukraine. Can you tell us about this story?
Yeah. So, one of the Pentagon's many leaks. I believe there's probably over 100 documents in circulation these days. How many more, we don't actually know. But what it does show is the US has been listening and monitoring, basically eavesdropping on the United Nations Secretary General and his top officials. And so one of the best things that we've learned from this eavesdropping is Antonio Guterres, the head of the UN, was, and in quotation marks, really pissed off with Volodymyr Zelensky after the Ukrainian president ambushed him with a surprise military medal ceremony on a visit to Kyiv in March. So aides of Guterres accused Zelensky of springing this event on their boss, and the classified intelligence briefing, which was first reported by the Washington Post, said that this is analysis from a US official basically reviewing the situation, that while Guterres was basically brought into this medal ceremony where ununiformed Ukrainian servicemen and women were handed out medals, and it could actually have been women only, sorry, because it was on International Women's Day. There's this great picture of Guterres basically looking stone-faced. He refuses to smile, and there's a quote in this document that says Guterres emphasised that he made a point of not smiling the entire time through the medal ceremony. And the Ukrainian president's office later released photographs and videos of the event, which basically implied that Guterres had congratulated Volodymyr Zelensky's military personnel. And the reason that Guterres is so pissed off is because he has tried to paint himself as this neutral mediator between Moscow and Kyiv. He thinks this could have damaged his sort of reputation as that neutral mediator who hasn't taken sides with one or the other. And say it's quoted that Mr. Gutierrez later told his spokesman that he travelled to Kiev to assist Ukraine, but the Ukrainians, and in quotations, do everything to liquidate us. The aide, Stefan Jurek, he later told the Washington Post that his boss was indeed unpleasantly surprised that a medal ceremony was added without consultation at the end of what had been a very productive meeting in Kyiv with Ukrainian leaders. But he did deny categorically that the term liquidation or liquidate had been used. But what this leaked briefing will do is add massive fuel to the fire. Especially, it's a kind of a long-held view in the US and a few other Western capitals, but the US are most vocal on this, that Gutierrez has been undermining international campaigns to hold Russia accountable for the invasion of Ukraine. And there are people you can speak to, and they think that Gutierrez was too favourable in gifting concessions to Russia on alleviation from certain sanctions in order to get the grain deal over the line. They think he's probably too friendly with Moscow and Vladimir Putin, which is not what we're saying, but that's just a view that many hold. And essentially that is probably why this document was put into place, was just basically to echo a long-held American thought that Gutierrez is probably too friendly with Moscow and stepping in the way of US-led, or US, NATO, other kind of Western efforts to basically tell Russia that it's wrong for what it's doing. And they believe that Gutierrez could be muddying the waters of that. And I will stop there on that one.
Thank you very much, Joe and Francis, before that. Hamish to Breton Gordon, can we come to you? You're writing an op-ed for The Telegraph about the militarisation of Russia and Russian society. Could you talk us through your argument and your piece?
Yes, no, absolutely. And I think that'll be up later today. So I don't want to go into exactly replicate it. But basically, my contention is that Russia is turning into a military dictatorship, which will ultimately lead to its total collapse. I think the last vestiges of democracy in Russia are burning on the fields of the Donbass. And democracy has never sat well with Putin, the KGB officer. But he knows the only hope of victory and prolonging his tenure as the last great Tsar is the total militarization of Russia. And Moscow seems to be descending into this military dictatorship very rapidly. Putin's United Russia Party is promoting its veterans of his war in Ukraine as candidates in regional elections, with the party's secretary general ordering that they give him the full support. And the Kremlin's rhetoric frequently evokes the great patriotic war against Nazi Germany, either directly or through insinuation that Russia once again stands against fascism and Nazism. His militarization of its dictatorship, to me, is now a sure sign that cracks are appearing around his citadel. Earlier this week, the jailing of the opposition figure Vladimir Kara-Murza is tragic, but not unsurprising. And of course, the likes of Navalny and all opposition figures and dissenters, have disappeared off the stage. And then when we look at casualty rates, and I had some very interesting discussions over the last few days in town, which I'll come on to a bit, about the military. There appears to be about 750,000 troops either mobilized or active in the Russian military at the moment, but the casualty rates are horrendous, and we've discussed them before. US and UK governments saying 220,000 dead or wounded, out of 750,000. These are horrendous rates, but these are not the children of the Moscow elite. They're normal people who don't matter to the Kremlin. And I think Putin's effort to put veterans as politicians across vast swathes of Russia could well be intended to silence any critics of what is a self-inflicted genocide. So the only way for him to prolong this in any form is very much the militarization, getting rid of any democratic leanings in the country. But I think, and others think, that this is the beginning of the end. So that's generally the piece on militarisation. Much more detail in the piece later. Over.
Thanks, Hamish. Just quickly on that, could we just dig into that slightly? I mean, you say this could be the beginning of the end. Why exactly? Why should it follow that the end is in sight?
Well, I think it comes on to something that I also put in there. I haven't gone into detail. Really, the dysfunctionality of the Russian military, which I had not really considered in great detail, but it has been explained to me. I sort of rather glibly said, well, it can't be any more dysfunctional than the British military. And ex-soldiers like Dom and myself, we have jocular fights with our friends, particularly in the Royal Air Force, but in the Navy as well. But I understand that there is completely dysfunction between the three services and within the three services, and the cadre of regular personnel, particularly in the army. I'll focus on the army. Is very small. The majority of casualties, certainly in the early days, were the experience within this military. And you reported a story some weeks ago, I think it was, of special forces units pretty much decimated in the Russian military, being used for what we would call normal infantry tasks. So you have a majority of an army now that is conscripts, who are these children of the East who have been recruited, given virtually no training. So actually, you have this vacuum between the bayonets, if you like, who have very little training at the front, and Putin and his close advisors, senior military, and virtually nothing in between. And the only way he can keep this going is by militarization, enforcing enlistment, and stamping down on dissent wherever it might happen across the country. So that is sort of what I'm getting at.
Thanks, Hamish. Just two things. One question from me. So you've set out your thesis, I think, very convincingly and eloquently. What does this mean for Ukraine and her friends and allies?
Well, I think we are moving into the next stage of this war. It is, and I don't think we're going to go into the offensive now and discuss it, but I think this is something to consider. And on the one side, we have a military that is driven by the desire to save its country, high morale, and driven by the desire to get the Russians out of there, supported by Western weaponry that they are now getting to grips with and now getting in numbers. And something like the Patriot, as Dom mentioned earlier on, hugely significant. I had a briefing on the Russian Air Force, which I hadn't realized how limited they are. I mean, they've got fantastic amounts of top jets, but I understand that they can actually only do attacks in sort of onesies and twosies. They can't coordinate more than that. They might have lots and lots of these onesies and twosies, but they're going out, doing something and coming back. But there is a reticence, I understand, in the Russian Air Force to actually get up over Ukraine and fight, because they know their chances of getting shot down are pretty high. And now that the Patriots are there, they can, I don't know what the exact operating orders for these Patriots are going to be. But as Dom said, 150-kilometer range, these things can be taken out quite far away. So I think, when you look at it like that, you have a sophisticated, well-motivated army on one side, and whatever is being said in these leaks about lack of ammunition and missiles, etc., that might well have been the point 7 or 8 weeks ago. And on the other side, you've got a conscript army that, in effect, has suffered 30% casualties of very poorly trained, poorly motivated, and badly led soldiers who are static. I mean, we've discussed it before, the inability of the Russian forces to be able to conduct maneuver warfare, I think has staggered all of us. But we know now that they cannot do it. They can sit and fight, and Putin, by militarizing, is just throwing more and more people into the meat grinder, a piece that I wrote last week, and that's all they can do. And I think there will come a point where this First World War army, the Russian army, fighting this 21st century Ukraine military, is going to collapse. And by Putin really trying to save his own czarship, as it were, and nobody else around him being able to influence him to, when things go badly, what we're all taught at Sandhurst and elsewhere is, if your plan's not working, have a think and come up with another plan, but do something. If you keep doing the same thing and it's failing, it will continue to fail. So that is the way that I am sort of looking at and suggesting that's where the Red Army could crumble over the next few months.
Thanks, Hamish. You mentioned you've been having quite a few interesting conversations. Anything more you can tell us, any more updates there before we go to Francis and Dom to come in on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just say one. I had a very interesting chat, and I think the paper reported Putin's visit to the front line the other day on the state of his health, and I think there is a view that that is probably something that is becoming more significant, and perhaps look at, when you see him in pictures over the next few weeks, how close he stands to people. So that the other bits and pieces, I think, the cadre of experienced military was something I thought was hugely significant. The fact that, all their special forces and others have been decimated, and the inability of their air force, this massive air force, to do anything except sort of fairly basic operations.
Thank you very much for that, Hamish. Francis or Dom, would you like to come in on that before we go to our final thoughts?
Thanks, David. Just one thing to pick up on what Hamish was saying. It was interesting him talking about the shift within Putin's regime and how it has taken on a more military character. And I just wanted to flag that historically, when regimes do this and you associate your success, your popularity and the political acolytes around you with the military, then you're really absolutely better hope that you're successful militarily, because it does facilitate a very, very rapid decline in popularity and usually an overthrow when things go wrong. And you can think of numerous comparisons. Hamish made a comparison there with Putin and the Tsar. Well, famously, Nicholas II, one of the things that brought him down during the First World War was his disastrous decision to associate more closely with the Russian armed forces. He took sole command, effectively, or at least that he was the head of the armed forces during the disastrous campaigns that eventually led with his overthrow in February of 1917. And then, of course, the provisional government made similar mistakes in terms of its associating its regime with the failed offensives and Kerensky offensive, which then led to its overthrow by the Bolsheviks. So it's very dangerous. It was similar too, I think, with the Falklands War and the military junta there. They associated everything with their regime on success in the Falklands. And so when the British managed to defeat them there, then of course the whole thing proved to be an utter disaster, and eventually they too were overthrown, something that actually Margaret Thatcher predicted and thought that would happen if they were sort of tested, that quite often these regimes are sort of paper tigers. So I just wanted to flag that in many ways it's logical that when you're fighting a war that you want to surround yourself with military figures, with military iconography and all of those things. But if things then start to go wrong on the battlefield, it can be very, very dangerous indeed for those individuals. And this is why, of course, what happens on the battlefield and the fate there of the Russian army will almost certainly have an impact on Putin's fate back home.
Thank you very much, Francis. Thank you, Dom, Francis, Joe and Hamish for your time today. Can I go to your final thoughts? Dom, would you like to go first?
Thanks, David. I'll just finish with a slight riff on what Hamish was just saying a moment ago about how this is, even though we talk about the certain stalemate at the moment in the Donbass as World War I-like, and that is because it's positional and very highly attritional, that's because that's the way that Russia is fighting and Ukraine is choosing to fight. The counteroffensive is unlikely to be an up and atom lads type affair. And I just made the point that just because it is, we compare it to World War I, doesn't mean that it's going to remain like this for forever, because of course at the end of the First World War and the 100-day campaign right at the very end, I mean, that was manoeuvrous. That was when tanks and everything started to work together. So if Russia sticks to this, and if it's all Russia is conceptually able to do, a very positional defence, then then that can be beaten. It takes brains, it takes willpower, and yes, a certain amount of blood, but it can be defeated with the right application of military power. So I don't think we should be too concerned that it is just, at the moment, seems to be becoming fixed in trench lines, because they can be defeated. They were defeated 100 years ago. They can be defeated now. So we shouldn't read too much into it.
Thank you very much, Dom. Joe Barnes.
Well, to end today, I'm going to throw forward to Friday, when the Ramstein group, this US-led effort of around 54 Western countries, get together to talk about what military aid they can give to Ukraine and how to get it to Ukraine. They're meeting at Ramstein, the US airbase in Germany, on Friday, and it looks like, so just like me and Dom sat through this Western official briefing yesterday, and the Western official said, look, the lack of Russian kind of long-range missile attacks has given Ukraine an opportunity to bolster its supplies, to basically start building a stockpile of air defense systems, and missiles. But we do know that sort of the S-300s, as Dom alluded to, the other various book systems, the Soviet-made systems, they are finite because they are made by Russia, and Russia isn't going to replace Ukraine's stocks. Obviously, Ukraine can go to other countries that operate these systems, but again, they are finite, and many of them are still friendly with Russia, so wouldn't want to be seen donating those weapons to Ukraine. So as we go into Friday, I'd expect, and I think we're seeing it already, sort of Ukrainian officials, Alexei Reznikov, the defense minister, will start going to his Western allies, to Ukraine's Western allies. Look, we need more when it comes to air defense systems and the ammunition that is fired from them. And they will point to a bit of some information from the Pentagon leaks that suggested that Ukraine, by sort of this time next month, I think it was between the 23rd and the 25th of May, would not have enough systems and air defense ammunition to decide whether it could defend its troops on the front line or its cities. So they are going to really use that as their own ammunition. Kyiv will use that leak as its own ammunition to secure more ammunition from its Western allies to protect its skies. And I think that's going to be a big focus. Rather than talk of tanks and jets, we'll revert back to sort of more simplified, give us air defence systems when they meet on Friday. And I'll stop there. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Joe. Francis Dearnley, can I come to you for your very final thoughts?
Thanks, David. Just to end today, I wanted to flag an important piece in The Guardian, one of the most detailed first-hand accounts of atrocities committed by Russian forces in Ukraine. It's an extended interview with Alexei Savichev, 49. He's a former Russian convict recruited by Wagner last September, and he talks about participating in summary executions of Ukrainian prisoners of war during his 6 months of fighting in eastern Ukraine. Some of the quotations from it are pretty harrowing, to be frank, but I think it's important that we draw attention to them. So he describes how we were told not to take any prisoners and would just shoot them on the spot. He cites one instance in Soledar last autumn where he participated in the killings of 20 Ukrainian soldiers who were surrounded. He says, "We sprayed them with our bullets. It is war, and I do not regret a single thing I did there. If I could, I would go back." There's another episode he describes with other Wagner fighters. He killed several dozen apparently injured Ukrainian POWs by tossing grenades into a ditch where they were held near the city of Bakhmut in January. He says, "We would torture soldiers too. There weren't any rules." Now, the original source for this story is a website by a rights group. I think the website is gulagu.net, and he appeared in an original interview alongside a former Wagner fighter who said he'd also killed civilians, including children, during the Battle of Bakhmut. And I mean, I hesitate to read this, it's so horrific, but I think it's, as I say, important that we do raise it. He describes an incident where a group of people who'd been taking shelter in the basement of a 9-floor block of flats in Bakhmut, including a young girl who was screaming, and he says, "She was screaming, she was a little kid, she was 5 or 6, and I shot her, a kill shot. I wasn't allowed to let anyone out, you understand." So egregious war crimes. Of course, these are denied very much by the Wagner group. Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of Wagner, has said that the account of these two soldiers is a flagrant lie, and that Wagner fighters have never touched and do not touch children. But nonetheless, there are many people this morning who are talking about that this is just further evidence of the atrocities that have been committed by Wagner, a group, after all, that send hammers to people as their calling card. And there are some other insights, I should add, in the piece, talking about how these prisoners were recruited, talks about how of an estimated 100 prisoners, only 21 returned alive from their posting, and generally has quite a lot of insights on these things. But the most important side of it is, of course, this horrific war crimes evidence that will, I'm sure, be vital for future trials, but also reminds us now as to the brutality of the war that is being waged by Russian forces in Ukraine. It should really be a front page story everywhere. But the tragedy is that it's become just something that is seemingly we've become used to in this horrific war. But nonetheless, I thought it was important to raise this as one of the most egregious examples, and there are many now, of the kind of atrocities that are being committed on a daily basis in Ukraine.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to podcast apps. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and today on Twitter, Robbie Nichols.